The steady beep of heart monitors suddenly turned erratic in operating room 3. Thomas lay unconscious, his life hanging by a thread as surgeons worked frantically to stabilize him. The room fell into controlled chaos, but no one noticed the dark figure that slipped in during the momentary staff rotation. Magnus stood over Thomas's unconscious form, his weathered face twisted into a cruel smile. "Look at you now, boy," he whispered, leaning close to Thomas's ear, "playing the hero, thinking you could save that girl from me, but you forgot I always win." He straightened up, checking the empty doorway. "When you're gone, everything you left to Odette becomes mine. I'll make sure she suffers, just like you did." Across town, the police station's phone rang sharply. "Sir," a trembling voice reported, "there's something you need to know about the Odette case. The man who calls himself Heron, he's not who he claims to be. He's Magnus, the same man who—" The line went dead. In the operating room, Thomas's heart rate spiked again. Through the haze of anesthesia, something in him sensed the presence of his childhood tormentor. His fingers twitched, fighting against the restraints, as if reaching for something or someone beyond his grasp. In the polished marble lobby of Thomas Bennett Enterprises, a tense silence fell as the CEO's elevator doors opened. Thomas Bennett emerged, his tailored suit and commanding presence causing employees to avert their eyes and bustle in different directions. At 42, he had built an empire from sustainable design, transforming discarded materials into luxury items. But the warmth his products promised stood in stark contrast to the cold efficiency of their creator. His morning routine was clockwork precise. At exactly 7:30 a.m., he would review the daily reports, his steel-grey eyes scanning spreadsheets for any hint of inefficiency. By 8 a.m., he was conducting his floor walk, each step measured and purposeful. Employees had learned to have everything in perfect order before his arrival, knowing his intolerance for even minor mistakes. Mr. Bennett, his assistant Sarah ventured, hurrying to keep pace with his long strides. "The Christmas Charity Committee would like your approval for—" Denied, Thomas cut her off without breaking stride. "Christmas is a distraction. This is a workplace, not a holiday resort." His voice, like cut glass, left no room for argument. The corner office that served as his domain reflected his personality, minimalist, organized, and devoid of personal touches. No family photos graced his desk. No memento suggested a life beyond these walls. The only decoration was a single award for business excellence, its crystal surface regularly dusted but never truly admired. During the morning's executive meeting, Thomas sat at the head of the conference table, his presence filling the room with an almost palpable tension. When the marketing director suggested a seasonal promotion, Thomas's response was characteristically brutal. "Sentiment doesn't drive profit," he stated, his words precise and cutting. "If you can't present a strategy based on data rather than feelings, perhaps you're in the wrong position." The director, a veteran of 15 years, seemed to physically shrink in his chair. Later that afternoon, as Thomas reviewed acquisition proposals, a maintenance worker accidentally dropped a ladder outside his office. The resulting clang sent him bolt upright, his hands gripping the desk edge until his knuckles turned white. For a brief moment, something flickered behind his eyes, a shadow of remembered fear, before his mask of control snapped back into place. Those who had worked at Bennett Enterprises longest whispered about their boss's past, about the man who had arrived in the city with nothing but determination and demons he never discussed. They noticed how he flinched at sudden loud noises, how he avoided the office Christmas party like it carried plague, how his eyes sometimes grew distant when he looked out his window at the children playing in the park below. But Thomas had spent years perfecting the art of keeping others at arm's length. His success was built on transforming broken things into objects of value, yet he seemed unable or unwilling to apply that same principle to his own fractured soul. As darkness fell over the city, he remained in his office, the last light burning in the building, as if afraid to face the emptiness that waited at home. 25 years earlier, young Thomas huddled in the corner of his bedroom, his trembling hands clutching a battered Christmas ornament, the last gift his mother had given him before Magnus's rage had shattered their world. The sounds of breaking glass and his father's drunken shouts echoed through their small house, each crash making the 12-year-old flinch as if physically struck. "Where's that useless boy?" Magnus's voice thundered from downstairs. The heavy tread of his boots on the stairs sent Thomas scrambling under his bed, a hiding place that had proven futile too many times before. The door burst open, flooding the darkened room with harsh hallway light. Magnus stood in the doorway, silhouetted like a monster from Thomas's nightmares. Playing with Christmas decorations again, Magnus sneered, yanking Thomas from his hiding place. "Your mother filled your head with this nonsense. Look where it got her." He grabbed the ornament from Thomas's hands and hurled it against the wall, the delicate glass shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. Thomas's mother, Evelyn, had always tried to make Christmas special, even in their poverty. She would save pennies all year to buy one new ornament, telling Thomas that each one represented hope for a better future. But last Christmas, when Magnus had come home in one of his rages, she had stepped between him and Thomas one final time. The police report would later call it an accident, a tragic fall down the stairs during a domestic dispute. The reality haunted Thomas's dreams, his mother's desperate plea for him to run, the sickening sound of impact, the spreading crimson that turned their shabby carpet an even darker shade of red. Magnus had disappeared that night, leaving Thomas alone with the aftermath. The boy had run until his legs gave out, finally collapsing at the doors of Santa Esperanza Community Shelter. In the years that followed, Thomas buried himself in work and study, transforming his pain into drive. He learned to hide his flinches, to mask his fear with authority, to build walls so high that no one could scale them. The small boy who once believed in Christmas magic disappeared, replaced by someone harder, colder, determined never to be vulnerable again. The police never found Magnus. Some said he'd fled to Mexico, others swore they'd seen him in Canada. But for Thomas, his father existed as a shadow that darkened every Christmas, every moment of joy, every attempt at human connection. The trauma wrote itself into his body in the way he positioned himself to always face doors, in his meticulously controlled environment, in his inability to trust or accept comfort from others. Even decades later, Thomas would sometimes wake in cold sweats, his sheets twisted around him, the echo of Magnus's boots on the stairs still thundering in his ears. In those moments he would walk to his office window and stare at the city below, counting the lights until his heartbeat steadied, reminding himself that he was no longer that helpless child. He had built an empire of steel and glass, but the foundations still trembled with the aftershocks of that Christmas night. In a rundown neighborhood on the city's outskirts, 8-year-old Odette sat on the floor of a dimly lit living room, watching her adoptive father Heron sink deeper into his nightly ritual of alcohol and anger. The room, like their relationship, was filled with shadows and unspoken fears. Empty bottles lined the windowsill, catching what little light filtered through the grimy glass. Heron, known to the adoption agency as a respectable widower, had mastered the art of deception. In public he played the role of the caring father who had opened his heart to an orphaned child. But behind closed doors he was a different man entirely. His weathered face, lined with years of bitterness, would contort with barely contained rage at the slightest provocation. "Look at you, sitting there like a princess," he slurred, taking another long drink from his bottle. "Do you think food appears by magic? That this roof over your head is free?" His words, sharp as broken glass, made Odette shrink further into herself. The smell of cheap whiskey and stale cigarettes filled the air, a nauseating combination that had become the soundtrack to her nights. During the day, Odette attended Lincoln Elementary School, where teachers noted her exceptional artistic talent but worried about her withdrawn nature. She would spend hours drawing elaborate Christmas scenes, happy families gathered around decorated trees, scenes she could only imagine. Her art teacher, Mrs. Reynolds, had tried to inquire about the bruises that occasionally appeared on Odette's arms, but the girl had perfected the art of deflection, just as she had learned to predict Heron's moods. The social workers who occasionally checked on them saw only what Heron wanted them to see: a modest but clean home, a quiet child, and a father doing his best despite limited means. They didn't notice how Odette's eyes would dart to Heron's face during their visits, watching for the subtle signs that promised punishment once they left. They missed the way her small hands trembled when he stood too close. In her small bedroom, Odette kept a secret box under a loose floorboard. Inside was a worn photograph of her birth mother, Sarah Williams, who had died under mysterious circumstances 2 years ago. The official report cited an accident, but Odette remembered fragments of that night: raised voices, a crash, and then silence. Shortly after, Heron had appeared, claiming to be a distant relative, and the overwhelmed system had granted him custody. Now, as winter approached and Christmas decorations began appearing in shop windows, Odette felt the tension in their small house growing. Heron's moods darkened with the season, his demands for money becoming more urgent. She knew what would come next, the familiar pattern of being sent out to beg on the streets, her small hands extended to strangers in the hopes of bringing home enough to appease him. What no one yet realized was that Heron's true identity lay buried beneath years of careful manipulation. Magnus had found that changing one's name was remarkably simple when one knew the right people and had patience. He had waited, planned, and finally found the perfect way to rebuild his life while continuing his cycle of destruction. On Christmas Eve, as darkness descended over the city's financial district, Thomas Bennet walked briskly through the snow-covered streets, his expensive leather shoes leaving precise imprints in the fresh powder. The city's festive decorations seemed to mock him, each twinkling light and cheerful window display serving as an unwelcome reminder of what this season truly meant to him. Leaving his office late was a deliberate choice, a way to avoid the forced merriment of the season. The streets were nearly empty now, most people already home with their families. Only the occasional sound of distant carolers broke the evening silence, their joyful songs carrying on the bitter wind. As he approached the corner of 5th and Madison, a small figure emerged from the shadows. A girl, no more than 8 years old, stood shivering in clothes too thin for the December cold. Her dark hair was dusted with snow, and her eyes held a weariness that seemed far too ancient for her young face. "Please, sir," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Christmas Eve. Could you spare something for food?" Her small hands, red from cold, extended toward him hopefully. Something about her stance, the way she seemed to brace herself for rejection, stirred uncomfortable memories in Thomas's mind. He stopped, despite his usual policy of ignoring street beggars. The girl's appearance triggered something deep within him, the echo of another child, decades ago, standing in similar circumstances. But instead of compassion, his response emerged as anger at the situation, at the memories it evoked, and at his own vulnerability in this moment. "Christmas," he said, his voice sharp enough to make the girl flinch. "You think Christmas means anything? That people will help you just because of some holiday?" His words carried the weight of personal pain, though the girl couldn't know this. "The world isn't kind, child. Learn that now. No one is going to save you." As soon as the words left his mouth, Thomas saw something break in the girl's expression. It was a look he recognized from his own childhood, the moment when hope begins to die. She backed away slightly, her shoulders hunching as if to make herself a smaller target, a defensive posture he knew all too well. The girl turned to leave, but not before Thomas caught a glimpse of a bruise partially hidden by her collar. The sight sent a jolt through him, triggering a cascade of unwanted memories, his own bruises, carefully hidden from teachers and neighbors, the silent signals of suffering that no one had noticed or had chosen not to see. He watched her disappear into the snowy night, her small footprints already being erased by fresh snowfall. Something tugged at his conscience, a voice that sounded remarkably like his mother's, urging him to act. But years of carefully constructed walls held him in place. He turned away, continuing his journey home, trying to ignore the growing unease in his chest. Yet even as he walked away, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would haunt him far longer than the ghosts of his past. That night, Thomas paced his penthouse apartment, unable to shake the image of the little girl from his mind. The encounter had cracked something in his carefully constructed facade, allowing long-buried memories to seep through. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a successful businessman, but his eyes betrayed the turmoil within. Each circuit of his living room brought fresh waves of memory, his mother's gentle hands tending to his bruises, her whispered assurances that things would get better, the Christmas ornaments she'd collect one by one throughout the year. He stopped at his drink cabinet, reaching for the crystal decanter, then froze, the gesture too reminiscent of Magnus. With trembling hands he replaced the stopper. "You're being ridiculous," he muttered to himself, straightening his tie in a reflexive gesture of control. "That girl is nothing to you. Just another street beggar." But even as he spoke the words, his mind overlaid the image of her bruised collar with memories of his own carefully hidden injuries. The parallel was too stark to ignore. His phone buzzed with messages from the office end-of-year reports requiring his attention, acquisition proposals to review. Work had always been his sanctuary, his shield against unwanted emotions. Yet tonight, the numbers on his screen blurred into meaninglessness. Instead, he found himself wondering what that girl was doing now, whether she had found shelter from the snow, whether anyone was looking for her at all. The sound of carolers drifting up from the street below sent him into another spiral of memories. Christmas Eve, 25 years ago, the crash of breaking glass, his mother's final scream, the feeling of frozen sidewalk under his bare feet as he ran. He pressed his forehead against the cool window glass, trying to ground himself in the present. You survived, he reminded himself firmly. You built this life. You don't owe anyone anything. The words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. His empire of sustainable design was built on the principle of transforming discarded things into objects of value, yet here he was, turning his back on a child who reminded him too much of himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent years cultivating an image of cold efficiency, letting his employees whisper about his hatred of Christmas, his intolerance for weakness. That armor had protected him, kept the world at bay. But seeing that girl had revealed the cost of his protection, the humanity he'd sacrificed in the name of survival. His gaze fell on the single photograph he allowed himself to keep, his mother, smiling, holding a Christmas ornament up to the light. "What would you think of me now, Mum?" he whispered. The silence of his luxury apartment offered no answer, but he could almost hear her voice. "It's never too late to change, Tommy. It's never too late to help someone else." The question was whether he was brave enough to try, whether he could risk dismantling the walls that had kept him safe for so long. Unable to rest, Thomas found himself driving through the snow-covered streets, following the small footprints that led away from their earlier encounter. The trail brought him to a dilapidated neighborhood where Christmas lights flickered weakly in grimy windows. He parked his car, watching as the girl, the same one he'd dismissed hours earlier, approached a run-down house at the end of the street. The front door opened before she reached it, spilling yellow light onto the snow. A man's silhouette appeared in the doorway, and Thomas's blood turned to ice. Even after 25 years, he would recognize that stance anywhere: the slightly hunched shoulders, the menacing tilt of the head. It was a posture that had dominated his nightmares for decades. "Finally, you ungrateful girl," the man's voice carried across the quiet street. "Where have you been? Did you get anything worth my time?" The tone was different, perhaps weathered by years and drink, but the underlying threat remained unchanged. Thomas gripped his steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, memories flooding back with devastating clarity. The man who called himself Heron grabbed the girl's arm roughly, pulling her inside, but in that moment, under the harsh porch light, Thomas caught a clear glimpse of his face. Time had changed him. His hair had grayed, deep lines carved new patterns in his face, but there was no mistaking Magnus Bennett, the man who had destroyed Thomas's childhood and killed his mother. Thomas's mind raced, piecing together the horrible symmetry of the situation. Magnus hadn't just disappeared after that fatal Christmas Eve, he had reinvented himself. The documentation would be forged, the background carefully constructed. How many other children had suffered while the authorities remained blind to his true identity? Through the window, Thomas could see the girl standing rigidly as Magnus, now Heron, berated her. The scene was so familiar it made his chest ache, the same intimidation tactics, the same psychological warfare that had once been used against him. History wasn't just repeating itself, it was being deliberately reconstructed by a monster who had never faced justice for his original crimes. The revelation left Thomas paralyzed between past and present. His rational mind screamed at him to call the police, but experience had taught him how easily Magnus could slip away, how skillfully he could manipulate the system. The girl needed immediate help, but Thomas knew firsthand the consequences of acting without a plan against someone like Magnus. A shocking thought struck him. Had Magnus orchestrated this? Had he somehow discovered Thomas's success and deliberately placed himself and this child in Thomas's path? The possibility sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the December cold. If so, the girl was just a pawn in a larger game, just as Thomas had once been. The choice before him was clear but devastating: walk away and preserve the safety he'd built for himself, or step into a nightmare he'd spent his entire adult life trying to escape. The first days in Thomas Bennett's penthouse apartment unfolded in a series of awkward silences and hesitant interactions. Odette, freshly rescued from Magnus's custody, moved through the luxurious space like a ghost, her small fingers trailing along marble countertops as if touching something that might disappear. The contrast between her previous life and this new reality couldn't have been starker. Thomas, for his part, found himself woefully unprepared for the role of guardian. His carefully ordered world, with its precise schedules and minimal personal attachments, had no framework for incorporating a traumatized 8-year-old. He hired the best child psychologist in the city, but struggled to handle the day-to-day emotional requirements himself. Is everything acceptable, he would ask stiffly at breakfast, watching Odette pick at elaborate meals prepared by his newly hired chef. His attempts at conversation felt mechanical, each word carefully measured, as if addressing a particularly delicate business negotiation. Odette would respond with quiet nods, her eyes fixed on her plate, both of them trapped in a dance of mutual uncertainty. The penthouse's spare rooms, previously used for storing files and awards, were hastily transformed into a child's bedroom. Thomas spared no expense, ordering the finest furniture and educational toys, yet the space remained eerily untouched. Odette preferred to curl up in the window seat of the living room, sketching Christmas scenes in a notebook she kept close, her only possession from her previous life. One morning, Thomas found her carefully arranging her few belongings in a small bag. "Are you sending me back?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling but resigned. The question struck him like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the inadequacy of his efforts thus far. "No," he replied, more forcefully than intended, then softened his tone. "This is your home now, Odette. I'm just learning how to be better at this." The words felt foreign in his mouth, an admission of imperfection he would never allow in his professional life. Their breakthrough came unexpectedly during a power outage. As darkness enveloped the penthouse, Thomas found Odette huddled in a corner, shaking. Without thinking, he sat beside her and began sharing stories about his own childhood fears. For the first time, his corporate facade cracked, revealing glimpses of the scared boy he'd once been. That night, as they sat together with flashlights casting shadows on the walls, something shifted between them. Odette began asking questions about his life, and Thomas found himself answering with unprecedented honesty. The power returned hours later, but they remained talking, beginning to forge a tentative bond built on their shared understanding of trauma and survival. Still, Thomas struggled with physical displays of affection, his body stiffening awkwardly when Odette would occasionally seek comfort. Each attempt at emotional connection felt like navigating unmarked territory, challenging years of carefully constructed defenses. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, both began to adapt, creating their own unique language of care and understanding. The whispers began in the hallways of Bennett Enterprises almost immediately after Thomas took in Odette. The corporate rumor mill, usually focused on mergers and promotions, now buzzed with speculation about their CEO's unexpected ward. Sarah, his longtime assistant, noticed how employees would fall silent when Thomas passed, their eyes following him with newly critical gazes. "It's all very convenient, isn't it?" Margaret from accounting remarked during a coffee break. The infamous Christmas-hating CEO suddenly becomes a guardian to a poor child right when the company's facing public scrutiny over our community engagement policies. Her words, though whispered, carried weight among her colleagues, many of whom had experienced Thomas's legendary coldness firsthand. The executive board meeting that week was particularly tense. Board member James Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically before addressing the elephant in the room. "Thomas, while we applaud your charitable initiative, there are concerns about how this might affect the company's image. Taking in a street child, people might see it as a publicity stunt." Thomas sat rigidly in his chair, his face an impassive mask. The suggestion that he would use Odette for corporate gain struck deeper than he let show, but years of business negotiations had taught him to hide his emotions well. "My personal life is not up for discussion," he responded coldly, effectively ending the conversation but inadvertently reinforcing his reputation for emotional detachment. The situation worsened when the press caught wind of the story. Local newspapers began running speculative pieces about the corporate Scrooge's Christmas conversion, suggesting that Thomas's guardianship of Odette was nothing more than a calculated move to soften his public image. Some even implied that he was attempting to distract from rumors about upcoming layoffs in the company's manufacturing division. Even Thomas's most loyal employees found themselves questioning his motives. They had witnessed years of his apparent disdain for anything resembling charity or emotional display. The man who had once fired an entire department for organizing a Christmas toy drive now claimed to be acting out of pure altruism. It seemed too contradictory to be believable. In the employee break room, a photo of Thomas and Odette leaving his building made its rounds. "Look at his face," someone pointed out. "He's not even looking at her. It's like she's just another business acquisition." The observation stung particularly because there was a grain of truth to it. Thomas's awkwardness with showing affection was visible in every public interaction with Odette. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Thomas. His years of carefully cultivated emotional distance, intended as armor against the world, now served as evidence against his sincerity. The very traits that had helped him build his empire were undermining the most genuine action he'd taken in decades, yet he couldn't find the words to defend himself without revealing the painful truth about his own past, a vulnerability he wasn't ready to share. The affluent neighborhood surrounding Thomas's penthouse responded to Odette's arrival with barely concealed disapproval. At the prestigious Riverside Elementary School, where Thomas had enrolled her, mothers gathered in tight clusters during pickup time, their conversations falling silent as he approached with Odette. The school's initial enthusiasm about accepting a Bennett Enterprises scholarship student had cooled to polite tolerance. Principal Matthews called an emergency parent-teacher association meeting to address concerns about the new student. "While we support diverse backgrounds," she stated diplomatically, "there are questions about the stability of Miss Williams's home situation." The underlying message was clear: a single man with no parenting experience, known for his ruthless business practices, was not considered a suitable guardian. Social services, prompted by anonymous calls, began conducting unexpected visits to Thomas's penthouse. The social worker, Ms. Parker, scrutinized every aspect of their living arrangement with barely concealed skepticism. "Mr. Bennett," she would say, making careful notes, "can you explain why you, specifically, felt qualified to take in a child with Odette's background?" The neighbors in Thomas's luxury building filed complaints about unusual activity, their euphemism for Odette's occasional nightmares that would wake her screaming. The building's board suggested that perhaps a ground floor unit would be more appropriate. For a family situation, their tone implying that penthouses were reserved for a different class of resident. Local charity organizations, which had long sought Thomas's support without success, now viewed his guardianship of Odette as hypocritical. "He rejected our children's hospital fundraiser last year," the director of one foundation told a reporter, claiming that emotional appeals had no place in business decisions. "Now he wants us to believe he suddenly developed a heart." Even Odette's former caseworker expressed doubts. "Mr. Bennett's financial resources are not in question," she wrote in her assessment, "but his emotional capacity to care for a traumatized child remains unproven. His motivation for this sudden interest in child welfare requires further investigation." The community's judgment manifested in subtle but painful ways. Birthday party invitations for Odette's classmates mysteriously excluded her. Parents would usher their children away when she approached the playground. The building staff, who had previously treated Thomas with deferential respect, now watched him with wary suspicion, as if expecting to witness some form of misconduct. Thomas bore the community's disapproval with outward stoicism, but each slight against Odette cut deeper than any business criticism he'd ever faced. The irony was bitter. His attempt to prevent history from repeating itself had instead cast him as the villain in a different narrative. Yet he couldn't defend himself without exposing both his and Odette's traumatic past to public scrutiny, a price he wasn't willing to make her pay. The prestigious Madison Medical Center's waiting room offered little comfort as Thomas sat reviewing quarterly reports, his tablet computer a shield against the worried glances of other patients. The persistent chest pain he'd been ignoring for weeks had finally become impossible to dismiss, particularly after nearly collapsing during a board meeting the previous day. Dr. Richardson's office, with its carefully curated atmosphere of professional reassurance, felt suffocating as Thomas listened to the diagnosis. "Mr. Bennett, the tests reveal a serious condition," the cardiologist explained, his practiced tone doing little to soften the impact. "You have significant arterial blockage requiring immediate intervention. Without surgery, the prognosis is concerning." The doctor continued discussing surgical options and success rates, but Thomas's mind had already shifted to Odette. The legal guardianship papers were still being processed. If something happened to him now, she would return to the system, or worse, Magnus might find a way to claim her. The thought sent his heart monitor readings spiking, drawing a concerned glance from Dr. Richardson. The surgery carries its own risks, the doctor continued, displaying various imaging results on his screen. Given the complexity of your condition, I estimate a 70% chance of success. However, delaying the procedure significantly reduces those odds. The statistics, usually Thomas's comfort zone, now seemed coldly inadequate to address the weight of his situation. Later that evening, Thomas sat in his home office, methodically organizing his affairs. His fingers hesitated over the estate planning documents. Everything would go to Odette, but how could he ensure Magnus wouldn't find a way to access it? The irony wasn't lost on him. After decades of building walls to protect himself, his heart had literally begun to fail just as he'd found someone worth opening it to. The symptoms had been there for months: the shortness of breath he'd attributed to stress, the arm pain he'd dismissed as work-related tension. Now, reviewing security footage of his building's lobby, he noticed his own reflected image, the pallor he'd ignored, the slight stoop that had developed in his usually rigid posture. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Odette stood in the doorway, clutching her sketchbook. "Are you working late again?" she asked, her perceptive eyes noting the medical papers he quickly tucked away. Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but this time it wasn't just the physical condition. The thought of leaving her vulnerable, of failing to protect her as his own mother had once tried to protect him, was unbearable. "Just some routine business matters," he replied, managing a smile that felt foreign on his face. He had 15 days to arrange everything before the surgery, 15 days to ensure Odette's safety, to strengthen the legal barriers against Magnus, to prepare for all possibilities. The weight of this secret pressed against his chest with more force than any medical condition. While organizing his medical paperwork late one evening, Thomas discovered a worn envelope that had slipped behind his filing cabinet. Inside was a yellowed newspaper clipping from 25 years ago, detailing the night he had fled from Magnus. As he scanned the article, a familiar name caught his eye: Sarah Williams, listed as a key witness who had helped a young boy escape an abusive home situation. His hands trembling, Thomas pulled up Odette's adoption records on his computer. There it was, her mother's full name, Sarah Elizabeth Williams. The realization struck him with physical force. Sarah, the kind-hearted neighbor who had given him shelter that Christmas Eve, who had helped him reach the Santa Esperanza community shelter, was Odette's mother. Further investigation revealed a pattern too precise to be coincidence. Sarah had continued working with domestic abuse victims after helping Thomas, eventually becoming a counselor at the same shelter. She had died under suspicious circumstances 2 years ago, another accidental fall, eerily similar to the fate of Thomas's own mother. In his study, Thomas spread out the documentation: newspaper articles, police reports, and shelter records. Sarah had been investigating a series of suspicious adoptions shortly before her death. Her notes, which Thomas obtained through his legal team, showed she had begun to uncover a pattern of an individual using different identities to adopt vulnerable children. The final entry in her journal, dated just days before her death, contained a chilling observation: possible match with 1999 Bennett case. Similar Mo. Must verify identity. She had been close to exposing Magnus's new identity as Heron, and she had paid the ultimate price for her discovery. Thomas's security footage from the past month revealed something even more disturbing. Magnus had been watching his building, appearing in the background of several frames. This wasn't a random encounter. Magnus had deliberately placed Odette in Thomas's path, perhaps as a twisted form of psychological torture, or possibly as part of a larger scheme to access Thomas's wealth through the child. A photograph in Sarah's old case files showed her standing outside the shelter, arm around a younger version of herself. The resemblance between her and Odette was striking: the same determined set of the jaw, the same watchful eyes. Thomas remembered Sarah's kindness that night, how she had risked Magnus's wrath to help a terrified boy she barely knew. "I promised I'd help if I ever could," Thomas whispered to the photograph, remembering the words he'd spoken to Sarah as she helped him escape. "I didn't know it would be by protecting your daughter." The weight of this connection, this debt of honor, added new urgency to his mission to keep Odette safe. He couldn't fail Sarah's daughter the way he'd been unable to protect his own mother. The upcoming heart surgery now held higher stakes. It wasn't just about survival, but about fulfilling a promise made 25 years ago on another Christmas Eve. The corporate offices of Bennett Enterprises underwent their annual transformation as December approached, despite Thomas's well-known aversion to holiday celebrations. Outside his knowledge, employees had carefully decorated their workspaces with subtle festive touches, small wreaths, modest strings of lights, and understated ornaments that they hoped would avoid their CEO's notice. The breaking point came during a routine floor inspection. Thomas rounded a corner to find the main conference room transformed into what the employees had intended as a surprise Christmas celebration. A decorated tree stood in the corner while garlands and lights adorned the walls. The staff had gathered, hoping to include their boss in what they envisioned as a moment of communal warmth. Thomas stopped in the doorway, his face draining of color. The scene before him triggered a cascade of memories: shattered ornaments, his mother's screams, Magnus's rage. The employees' expectant smiles faded as they watched their CEO's expression shift from shock to something darker. "Who authorized this?" His voice cut through the festive music playing softly in the background. The room fell silent as Sarah, his assistant, stepped forward. "So we thought. With Odette now in your life, perhaps this year could be different." Her voice trembled slightly but held firm. "Different?" Thomas's laugh held no humor. "You deliberately violated company policy. Every person in this room directly disobeyed my explicit instructions regarding holiday celebrations." His gaze swept the room, taking in the faces of people who had worked for him for years. "You're all terminated. Immediately." The announcement fell like a physical blow. Linda from accounting burst into tears. She was a single mother with 3 children. James from marketing started to protest, reminding Thomas of his 15 years of loyal service. But Thomas remained unmoved, his trauma masquerading as corporate authority. "Clear your desks. Security will escort you out." He turned to leave, then paused. "And take down these decorations. I want them gone within the hour." The Christmas tree lights continued to twinkle mockingly as shell-shocked employees began gathering their personal belongings. Word spread quickly through the building. By day's end, 43 employees had been terminated, entire departments gutted because they had dared to celebrate Christmas. The media caught wind of the mass firing, dubbing Thomas the CEO who stole Christmas. Editorial cartoons depicted him as a corporate Scrooge, standing triumphantly over weeping employees. That evening, as Thomas sat in his darkened office reviewing replacement staffing plans, he caught his reflection in the window. For a moment he saw Magnus's face superimposed over his own, the same hardness, the same capacity for cruelty. The realization made him physically ill. In his attempt to escape his father's influence, had he become a different kind of monster? Below his window he watched his former employees leaving the building, carrying boxes of personal items, some consoling others. They had only wanted to create joy, to share the spirit of the season that his mother had once cherished. And he had responded with the same destructive force that had shattered his own childhood Christmases. The sterile hospital corridors hummed with muted activity as Thomas was prepared for surgery. His legal team had worked through the night to finalize Odette's guardianship papers, but the process remained incomplete. In his private room, Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, the pre-operative medication clouding his thoughts while his security detail maintained a vigilant watch outside. At the penthouse, Mrs. Henderson, the newly hired housekeeper, supervised Odette with practiced efficiency. The girl sat at the kitchen counter, mechanically completing her homework, when the building's intercom buzzed. "Package delivery for Mr. Bennett," announced the concierge. Mrs. Henderson, following standard protocol, descended to the lobby to verify the delivery. It was this momentary lapse in security that Magnus had anticipated. He emerged from the service elevator, having gained access through carefully forged maintenance credentials. His footsteps, deliberately quiet, carried him to the penthouse kitchen where Odette sat alone. The girl sensed his presence before she saw him, her pencil freezing mid-equation. "Hello, little one." Magnus's voice carried the same silky menace that had haunted Thomas's childhood. "Did you think you could escape me so easily?" Odette's fingers gripped her pencil until her knuckles turned white, but she didn't scream. Experience had taught her that screaming only made things worse. Magnus circled the kitchen island, his movements measured and predatory. "Your precious guardian isn't here to protect you now, is he?" He pulled out a chair, the scraping sound making Odette flinch. "We need to have a conversation about your future." His words dripped with calculated malice. He placed a document on the counter, legal papers that would transfer guardianship to him. "You're going to tell the authorities that Thomas has been hurting you," Magnus explained, his tone conversational but laden with threat. "That you want to return to my care. And if you don't," he let the silence complete his meaning. "They won't believe you," Odette whispered, her voice stronger than she felt. "There are cameras everywhere here." Magnus's laugh held no warmth as he reached into his jacket, producing printed photographs, surveillance shots of Thomas's building, hospital, and daily routines. "I've been watching for months, child. I know every detail of your new life. And if Thomas somehow survives his surgery," Magnus leaned closer, his breath carrying the familiar scent of contained violence, "accidents can always be arranged. Just ask your mother." The casual revelation of his involvement in her mother's death shattered something in Odette. Her eyes, wide with horror, met Magnus's cold gaze. You killed her," the question emerged as barely a whisper. Magnus's smile widened, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Smart girl. Now imagine what could happen to Thomas." One wrong medication, one slipped suture. He tapped the guardianship papers meaningfully. "The choice is yours. Sign these, testify against him, and he lives. Refuse." His shrug carried devastating implications. Mrs. Henderson's voice echoed from the lobby elevator, announcing her return. Magnus gathered the papers smoothly, straightening his jacket. "You have until tomorrow morning. Remember, his life depends on your decision. And Odette." He paused at the service entrance. "If you tell anyone about our little chat, I won't wait for the surgery to act." After he departed, Odette sat motionless, her homework forgotten. Mrs. Henderson bustled in, apologizing for the delay, completely unaware of what had transpired. The security cameras had captured nothing. Magnus had known exactly where to stand to avoid detection. In her room that evening, Odette stared at her phone, Thomas's hospital contact programmed on speed dial. Her finger hovered over the number, but Magnus's threats echoed in her mind. The choice before her seemed impossible: betray the man who had saved her, or risk losing him forever. The city lights twinkled outside her window, reminiscent of Christmas decorations, but now they seemed to mock her predicament. She was 8 years old, carrying the weight of a life or death decision. The irony wasn't lost on her. Christmas, which had brought Thomas into her life, might now be the season that forced her to give him up to save him. The media storm erupted the morning after Thomas's mass firing of employees. Local newspapers ran front-page stories featuring interviews with terminated staff members, their holiday plans now shattered by unemployment. The narrative quickly expanded beyond the Christmas decorations incident, drawing connections to Thomas's guardianship of Odette and suggesting a pattern of manipulative behavior. Channel 7 News aired an exclusive investigation into Thomas Bennett's past, featuring carefully edited interviews with former employees and business rivals. "He's always been calculating," declared one anonymous source. "Taking in that poor girl right before the holidays?" Classic Puerto Rico manipulation. The reporter emphasized the timing of Odette's arrival coinciding with Bennett Enterprises' bid for a major government contract requiring demonstrated community engagement. Principal Matthews called an emergency conference with the school board after receiving numerous complaints from parents. "Mr. Bennett's recent actions raise serious concerns about his emotional stability," she stated in a leaked memo. "The potential impact on Odette's well-being cannot be ignored." The school board began reviewing Odette's enrollment, citing the need to maintain a stable learning environment. Social services responded to an unprecedented number of anonymous tips regarding Thomas's fitness as a guardian. MS Parker, now conducting daily visits, documented every perceived deficiency: his long work hours, his apparent emotional detachment, his absence during Odette's school events. Each observation was colored by the public's growing conviction of his calculated cruelty. The Riverside Heights Neighborhood Association convened a special meeting to address the Bennett situation. Residents voiced concerns about property values declining due to the negative publicity. "We're known for being a family-friendly community," argued Association President Eleanor Richmond. "Mr. Bennett's actions reflect poorly on all of us." Even Thomas's most stalwart business allies began distancing themselves. Long-standing contracts were suddenly under review. Charitable organizations that had previously courted his donations publicly denounced him. The Business Leadership Council, where he had served as chairman, requested his temporary resignation to avoid unnecessary distractions. the final blow came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, gave a tearful interview to the Evening Standard, describing how Thomas barely interacted with Odette, leaving the child in the care of staff while he worked late hours. Her account, though lacking context, painted a damaging picture of emotional neglect. Throughout this upheaval, Thomas lay unconscious in his hospital room, unaware of how quickly his carefully constructed world was unraveling. Odette, trapped between Magnus's threats and the community's judgment, watched helplessly as public opinion turned against her guardian. The security team reported increasing incidents of protesters gathering outside Bennett Enterprises, their signs condemning Thomas as the Christmas killer of dreams. Legal authorities began reviewing the guardianship proceedings with renewed scrutiny. The judge assigned to the case requested additional psychological evaluations, citing the disturbing pattern of behavior evidenced by recent events. Thomas's legal team worked frantically to maintain control, but each new headline made their task more challenging. In the elegant corridors of Thomas's building, neighbors who had once nodded politely now crossed to the other side when encountering Odette. Their children were suddenly too busy for playdates. The doorman, who had always greeted her warmly, now watched with wary eyes, as if expecting to witness some confirmation of the rumors swirling through the city. The irony of the situation was profound. Thomas's attempt to protect Odette, driven by his own traumatic past, had instead created circumstances that threatened to separate them permanently. His absence during this crucial period, necessitated by life-saving surgery, was being interpreted as further evidence of his indifference. The community, eager to embrace a simplified narrative of corporate villainy, remained blind to the complex truth of their story. Mrs. Henderson stood in Thomas's penthouse kitchen, her weathered hands smoothing her immaculate apron as she contemplated the telephone before her. After 20 years of caring for wealthy families' children, she had developed what she considered an infallible moral compass. The anonymous letter she'd received that morning, detailing Magnus's claim as Odette's real father, had struck a chord with her deep-seated beliefs about biological family bonds. The evidence Magnus had provided seemed compelling, carefully doctored photographs showing him with a younger Odette, forged documentation of his relationship with her mother, and a heart-wrenching story of Thomas using his wealth to steal custody. Mrs. Henderson's own experience with divorced parents who used children as pawns made her particularly susceptible to this carefully crafted narrative. "It's for the child's best interest," she murmured, dialing the number Magnus had provided. Her conversation with him was brief but consequential. She agreed to be his eyes and ears within the penthouse, believing she was helping reunite a father with his daughter. The security code, staff schedules, and detailed information about Thomas's post-surgery care plan were exchanged under the guise of protecting Odette's welfare. Mrs. Henderson began subtly undermining Thomas's household routines. She accidentally misplaced important legal documents, delayed crucial messages from his attorneys, and provided Magnus with regular updates about Odette's movements. Her years of service made her above suspicion. Even the security team deferred to her authority in household matters. The betrayal cut deeper because of the trust Thomas had placed in her. He had specifically chosen Mrs. Henderson for her reputation with traumatized children, increasing her salary substantially to ensure Odette had consistent care during his hospitalization. Every act of generosity now served to reinforce Mrs. Henderson's belief that he was attempting to buy affection. Her detailed observations of Thomas's awkward attempts at parenting, reported daily to Magnus, helped shape the narrative of neglect that was spreading through the media. She didn't realize she was being manipulated, that her reports were being carefully edited and shared with journalists to paint Thomas in the worst possible light. Odette, perceptive beyond her years, noticed the subtle changes in Mrs. Henderson's behavior. The housekeeper's once warm smiles now carried a hint of pity, and her conversations became peppered with careful questions about Thomas's treatment of her. But Magnus's threats kept Odette silent, unable to warn anyone about the danger slowly infiltrating their home. The situation reached a critical point when Mrs. Henderson discovered Thomas's medical files, including details about his upcoming surgery. Believing she was protecting Odette from abandonment, she provided Magnus with complete access to Thomas's medical schedule and recovery plan. This information, in the hands of someone with Magnus's intentions, became a deadly weapon. Each evening, as Mrs. Henderson left the penthouse, she convinced herself she was acting righteously. She didn't notice how her helpful actions aligned perfectly with Magnus's carefully orchestrated plan to regain control of Odette. Her moral certainty blinded her to the fear in Odette's eyes whenever Magnus's name was mentioned, the same fear she had shown when first arriving at Thomas's home. The weight of her decisions would only become clear much later, when the full scope of Magnus's manipulations was revealed. By then, her well-intentioned betrayal would have set in motion events that would threaten not only Thomas's guardianship of Odette, but his very survival. The road to hell, as the saying goes, was being paved with her good intentions, each action driving them closer to a crisis that would shake their worlds to the foundation. Against explicit medical advice, Thomas discharged himself from the hospital upon discovering Odette's absence. The incision from his preliminary cardiac procedure was barely healed as he pushed his weakened body through the streets of the city, following leads on Odette's whereabouts. Each step sent waves of pain through his chest, but the fear of losing her drove him forward. His personal security team had traced Mrs. Henderson's phone records, revealing a pattern of calls to unlisted numbers. The betrayal struck Thomas deeply, but there was no time for recrimination. Hospital monitors had shown dangerous irregularities in his heart rhythm, and his doctors had warned that excessive exertion could prove fatal. Nevertheless, he persisted in his search, his face growing paler with each passing hour. The winter wind cut through his coat as he investigated another potential sighting, this time at a shelter near the city's outskirts. The medication he should have been taking remained untouched in his pocket. The side effects would have slowed his reactions. His body temperature dropped dangerously as he pushed himself beyond reasonable limits, ignoring the tremors in his hands and the increasing difficulty in breathing. Detective Sarah Martinez, assigned to Odette's case, observed Thomas's deteriorating condition with growing concern. "Mr. Bennett, you need medical attention," she insisted, noting how he braced himself against walls when he thought no one was watching. His response was unwavering. "I failed her mother. I won't fail her too." The words came between labored breaths, his typically commanding voice now rough with exhaustion. In his office at Bennett Enterprises, Thomas pored over security footage, his vision blurring as he searched for any sign of Magnus's movements. The strain was evident in his hunched posture and the fine sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the room's chill. His assistant found him slumped over his desk at dawn, medical alerts beeping unheeded on his phone. The cardiology team from Madison Medical Center made repeated attempts to contact him, warning that without immediate intervention, his condition would become critical. Thomas acknowledged their messages with silent dismissal, his focus entirely on the search. He had survived Magnus's abuse as a child. He would survive this too, if it meant keeping Odette safe. During a particularly intense bout of chest pain, Thomas found himself in the same neighborhood where he had first encountered Odette. The Christmas decorations that had once seemed offensive now appeared as beacons, illuminating possible search areas. Each storefront Santa, each twinkling light, represented another location to investigate, another chance to find her. His security detail reported that he had stopped eating, surviving on black coffee and sheer determination. The media, still camped outside his building, documented his physical decline with predatory interest. Headlines shifted from condemnation to morbid speculation about whether the Christmas-hating CEO would survive to see the holiday. Late one evening, as Thomas questioned contacts in yet another neighborhood, his heart began to race uncontrollably. The world tilted sideways, colors blurring into a kaleidoscope of holiday lights. Detective Martinez caught him before he hit the ground, her urgent calls for medical assistance competing with the sound of carols from a nearby church. In the emergency room, doctors fought to stabilize his condition. The preliminary surgery site showed signs of infection, and his heart rhythm remained dangerously erratic. Through his delirium, Thomas repeated Odette's name, trying to explain about Magnus, about Sarah Williams, about patterns of abuse that spanned decades. The medical staff exchanged worried glances, interpreting his desperate warnings as fever-induced hallucinations. Yet even as his body betrayed him, Thomas's mind continued to work, piecing together clues about Magnus's possible locations. He knew his opponent's methodology, his need for control, his preference for places with strategic exits. Somewhere in the city, Magnus was holding Odette, waiting to implement the next phase of his plan. The thought kept Thomas conscious through waves of pain, his determination burning brighter than the Christmas lights that filled his fragmented vision. While recovering in the hospital, Thomas received an unexpected delivery, a weathered box of case files from Detective Martinez's predecessor. Within its depths lay a revelation that would shatter his understanding of the past. The detective who had investigated his mother's death had continued gathering evidence long after the case was officially closed, driven by inconsistencies in the original investigation. The documented timeline revealed a chilling pattern. Magnus's violence hadn't been random outbursts but calculated acts designed to isolate and control. More disturbing was the discovery that Magnus was actually Thomas's maternal uncle, a fact his mother had kept hidden. A series of letters, preserved in the case files, showed that Evelyn had fled from her brother's increasingly disturbing behavior, changing her name and creating a new life to protect her young son. Detective Harrison's notes painted a devastating picture. Magnus had spent years tracking his sister, consumed by what he perceived as her betrayal. Their mother had favored Evelyn, showing her the love and acceptance that Magnus desperately craved. When she died, Magnus's obsession transferred to his sister, manifesting in a determination to destroy her happiness. The Christmas Eve tragedy took on new meaning with this context. Magnus hadn't just killed Thomas's mother, he had orchestrated her death as the ultimate act of revenge. The accidental fall had been carefully planned, timed to maximize the psychological impact on both mother and son. The detective's files included photographs of the crime scene that had been excluded from the official report, showing evidence of premeditation that had been overlooked. Most haunting were the parallels between Evelyn's death and Sarah Williams's accident years later. The same detailed planning, the same careful manipulation of evidence, the same Christmas season timing. Magnus hadn't just continued his pattern of abuse, he had refined it, learning from each incident how to better conceal his actions. Hospital monitors recorded Thomas's elevated heart rate as he processed this information. The genetic connection explained Magnus's ability to anticipate his reactions, to understand exactly how to inflict maximum psychological damage. But it also revealed why Magnus had targeted Odette. She represented another chance to destroy a family, to recreate the trauma that had shaped his own twisted worldview. The final pages of the detective's notes contained a theory that sent chills through Thomas. Harrison had suspected that Magnus's fixation on Christmas stemmed from a childhood incident, their mother's death on Christmas Eve, when Magnus was 12. The holiday had become both his trigger and his chosen weapon, a time when he could inflict the most meaningful pain on his victims. This revelation transformed Thomas's understanding of his own aversion to Christmas. His rejection of the holiday wasn't just a response to personal trauma, it was an inherited pattern, a defensive mechanism against Magnus's calculated cruelty. In pushing away everything associated with Christmas, Thomas had unknowingly mirrored his uncle's psychological wounds. But Sarah Williams had discovered this connection shortly before her death. Her final notes, included in the case file, showed she was close to exposing Magnus's true identity. She had recognized the pattern from Thomas's case, understanding too late that her investigation had made her a target. Magnus had silenced her using the same methods he had perfected with Evelyn, turning Christmas from a season of joy into a recurring nightmare for those who dared to oppose him. Thomas lay in his hospital bed, the weight of these revelations pressing against his chest with more force than his physical condition. The monster who had destroyed his childhood wasn't just a violent father, he was a calculating predator who had spent decades perfecting his methodology. And now he had Odette, another child to torture with his twisted version of family bonds. News of Thomas's medical crisis and Odette's disappearance reached the recently terminated employees through social media channels. Linda Matthews, the single mother from accounting, organized an emergency meeting at her small apartment, where 40 former Bennett Enterprises staff members gathered to share information and resources. "We may have lost our jobs," Linda addressed the group, "but this is about a child's safety." She revealed how she had noticed suspicious activities around the building in the weeks before their termination, a man matching Magnus's description photographing the entrance, unusual patterns in visitor logs, and inconsistencies in security protocols. James Wilson, the former head of security, whom Thomas had dismissed during the Christmas decoration incident, provided crucial insight into the building's surveillance blind spots. "Magnus must have studied our rotation schedules," he explained, spreading building schematics across Linda's dining room table. "The timing of his appearances suggests inside knowledge of our security procedures." The group established a coordinated search effort, leveraging their collective knowledge of the city and their professional networks. Marketing specialists utilized their media contacts to distribute accurate information about Magnus's history of violence, counteracting the negative narrative surrounding Thomas. HR personnel reached out to their contacts in social services, gathering additional details about Magnus's previous aliases. Sarah Chen, previously Thomas's executive assistant, accessed her archived emails, discovering patterns in Magnus's activities that had gone unnoticed. He always appeared near schools or playgrounds during specific times, she noted, helping to narrow down potential locations where he might be holding Odette. The terminated department, working from their personal computers, analyzed traffic camera footage around the building, identifying vehicles that had made multiple passes during suspicious timeframes. Their technical expertise, combined with their familiarity with the company's systems, provided law enforcement with valuable data points for tracking Magnus's movements. Detective Martinez was initially skeptical of this unofficial task force, but soon recognized the value of their insider knowledge. The former employee's understanding of Thomas's daily routines and security measures helped identify vulnerabilities that Magnus could have exploited. Their collaborative effort created a more comprehensive picture of his methodology than law enforcement had achieved alone. The group's most significant contribution came from Janet Torres, a former custodial supervisor. She recalled encountering Magnus disguised as a maintenance worker, accessing service areas several weeks before the mass firing. Her detailed description of his behavior and movement patterns helped police identify his likely escape routes and potential hiding places. Working in shifts, the former employees established a volunteer search network. Coordinating with local businesses and community centers, they distributed flyers, monitored social media channels, and maintained communication with Detective Martinez's team. Their efforts demonstrated a level of dedication that transcended their previous professional relationships with Thomas. Perhaps most remarkably, these individuals chose to help despite their recent termination and the financial hardships many were facing. They understood that their personal grievances with Thomas were insignificant compared to a child's safety and the possibility of stopping a long-term predator. As Thomas fought for his life in the hospital, his former employees became an unexpected army of allies, their collective determination driven by a shared understanding that some things like a child's welfare superseded corporate politics and personal resentment. Their actions represented a profound demonstration of human compassion, transforming a story of corporate coldness into one of community solidarity. The irony wasn't lost on them. The Christmas spirit that Thomas had tried so hard to suppress in his company had become the very force that united them in their effort to save Odette. Their collaborative search effort proved more effective than any holiday celebration could have been in embodying the true meaning of the season. The revelation of Magnus's true identity unfolded during a live press conference outside Madison Medical Center. Detective Martinez stood before a wall of microphones, presenting evidence that transformed the public's understanding of the case. Security camera footage played on screens behind her, showing Magnus's systematic surveillance of both Thomas's building and Odette's school, his multiple identities laid bare through meticulously compiled documentation. The man known to this community as James Heron is, in fact, Magnus Bennett, Detective Martinez announced, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. Our investigation has uncovered a pattern of identity theft and child exploitation spanning more than 2 decades. She methodically outlined Magnus's history, connecting him to multiple cases of domestic violence and suspicious deaths, including those of Evelyn Bennett and Sarah Williams. The assembled reporters, many of whom had contributed to vilifying Thomas, fell silent as Detective Martinez revealed the familial connection between Magnus and his victims. Documentation proved that Magnus had orchestrated his sister Evelyn's death, subsequently disappearing only to resurface years later under various aliases. His calculated pursuit of Thomas and Odette represented not random violence, but a carefully planned campaign of psychological torture. Mrs. Henderson, watching the broadcast from the police station, where she was providing her statement, collapsed into tears as she realized the magnitude of her unwitting contribution to Magnus's scheme. Her testimony, now crucial to the investigation, revealed how Magnus had manipulated her maternal instincts and religious beliefs to gain access to Thomas's household. Principal Matthews called an emergency assembly at Riverside Elementary, addressing parents who had previously condemned Thomas's guardianship of Odette. The evidence presented by law enforcement painted a starkly different picture from the narrative of corporate callousness they had accepted. Security footage showed Magnus monitoring the school grounds, his presence now recognizable in countless seemingly innocent photographs of school events. The Business Leadership Council convened a special session to publicly retract their request for Thomas's resignation. Board members who had distanced themselves from Bennett Enterprises now scrambled to demonstrate their support, though their previous abandonment had already revealed the superficiality of their professional relationships. Local news stations that had run sensationalized stories about Thomas's Christmas tyranny now broadcast in-depth investigations into Magnus's criminal history. Interviews with law enforcement officials from multiple jurisdictions revealed a pattern of targeting vulnerable families, particularly during the holiday season. Magnus's methodology became clear. He exploited the emotional significance of Christmas to maximize the psychological impact of his actions. The Riverside Heights Neighborhood Association, which had been so quick to condemn Thomas, organized a candlelight vigil outside the hospital. Residents who had previously signed petitions against him now stood in silent support, their holiday decorations taking on new meaning as symbols of hope for Odette's safe return. Detective Martinez concluded the press conference by addressing Magnus directly through the cameras. Your pattern of exploitation and violence ends now. We understand your methodology, your triggers, and your objectives. Every law enforcement agency in the state is looking for you. Her words carried the weight of absolute certainty, backed by the substantial evidence displayed behind her. The community's shifting perspective manifested in immediate, practical support for the search effort. Local businesses provided surveillance footage, residents opened their properties for police searches, and social media networks that had once spread condemnation now distributed accurate information about Magnus's appearance and known behaviors. As these revelations cascaded through the city, Thomas lay in intensive care, his condition still critical. The monitor beside his bed registered the turbulent rhythms of his heart as he drifted in and out of consciousness, unaware that the truth he had carried alone for so many years was finally being understood by the world beyond his hospital room. In the wake of Magnus's identity revelation, previously silenced victims began sharing their stories. The first came from Emily Richardson, now a social worker, who had encountered Magnus under the name Michael Harper at a different community shelter 15 years ago. Her detailed account of his methodical grooming techniques and exploitation of vulnerable families provided law enforcement with crucial insights into his long-term pattern of abuse. Following Emily's testimony, Charlotte Weber approached Detective Martinez with documentation from her time as an administrative assistant at the Santa Esperanza Community Shelter. She had maintained a private record of suspicious adoptions, noting similarities in the applications that had raised concerns. Her meticulous notes revealed Magnus's systematic approach to identifying and targeting potential victims, particularly during the holiday season. The Davidson family presented evidence of Magnus's interference in their lives under yet another alias. Their daughter, Rachel, had been briefly placed in his care through a fraudulent foster program he had infiltrated. Mr. Davidson's detailed journals chronicled the psychological manipulation Magnus had employed, using Christmas celebrations as a tool for emotional control and isolation. These testimonies established a clear timeline of Magnus's activities between his disappearance after Evelyn's death and his reemergence as Heron. Each account demonstrated his evolution as a predator, showing how he had refined his techniques over the years. The victim's stories shared common elements: his initial appearance as a concerned community member, his careful manipulation of social services documentation, and his strategic use of holiday celebrations to maximize psychological impact. Professional child advocates who had encountered Magnus in various contexts came forward with their own observations. Dr. Catherine Martinez, a child psychologist, provided insight into the lasting trauma his victims exhibited, particularly their complicated relationship with Christmas celebrations. Her analysis helped establish a psychological profile that proved invaluable to law enforcement's search efforts. Perhaps most significantly, former colleagues from various institutions where Magnus had worked under assumed identities began recognizing his pattern of behavior. Their combined testimonies revealed how he had systematically positioned himself in roles that provided access to vulnerable children, always maintaining a facade of respectability while carefully documenting potential targets. These revelations transformed the public's understanding of Thomas's apparent aversion to Christmas celebrations. What had been dismissed as corporate callousness was now recognized as a trauma response to Magnus's calculated use of the holiday season for maximum psychological impact. The community's judgment of Thomas's behavior shifted dramatically as they began to understand the depth of the wounds he had carried silently. Law enforcement officials compiled these testimonies into a comprehensive case file that demonstrated Magnus's methodology across multiple jurisdictions. The pattern that emerged showed not just a series of isolated incidents, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of abuse spanning decades. Each victim's story added another piece to the puzzle, helping authorities understand how Magnus had managed to evade detection for so long. The courage of these survivors in coming forward created a network of support for Odette's recovery. Their shared experiences provided valuable insights into Magnus's likely hideouts and potential next moves. More importantly, their testimonies helped dismantle the carefully constructed public persona Magnus had created, replacing it with a true picture of his systematic abuse of trust and authority. As these stories emerged, they formed a powerful counter-narrative to the previous public perception of both Thomas and Magnus. The community that had once condemned Thomas for his apparent coldness now understood that his actions had been shaped by experiences they were only beginning to comprehend. In the critical care unit of Madison Medical Center, Thomas faced an impossible decision. His cardiac condition had deteriorated to the point where immediate surgery was essential for survival, yet every moment spent in surgery was time lost in the search for Odette. Dr. Richardson presented the situation with clinical precision. Without immediate intervention, Thomas's chances of survival would drop below 20%. "The surgery cannot wait any longer," Mr. Bennett, Dr. Richardson explained, reviewing the latest test results. "Your heart function is severely compromised. Even with surgery, the recovery period will be precarious." The medical team had already prepared the operating room, understanding that time was a critical factor in both Thomas's survival and Odette's rescue. Detective Martinez stood at Thomas's bedside, offering a perspective that challenged his instinct to continue the search regardless of personal cost. "You cannot help Odette if you're dead," she stated firmly. "We have teams mobilized across the city. Your former employees have created an extensive search network. Let us continue while you focus on survival." Thomas gripped the hospital bed rails, his knuckles white with tension. The monitor beside him displayed increasingly erratic heart rhythms, providing physical evidence of the stress this decision was placing on his already weakened system. The choice before him seemed to echo the same impossible situation his mother had faced, sacrificing himself to protect a child from Magnus. After several moments of intense internal struggle, Thomas made his decision. "Schedule the surgery," he instructed Dr. Richardson, his voice steady despite his obvious distress. "But I need 10 minutes first." With trembling hands, he began writing detailed notes about Magnus's patterns, his likely hideouts, and the psychological triggers that might reveal his next moves. The medical team watched anxiously as Thomas documented everything he knew about his uncle's methodology. His insights, born from years of trauma and observation, provided law enforcement with critical information about Magnus's thought processes. Each note was annotated with specific examples from their shared history, creating a psychological profile that could prove invaluable to the search effort. "When you find him," Thomas told Detective Martinez, as the surgical team began their preparations, "remember that he sees Christmas as a weapon. He'll be somewhere that maximizes the holiday's psychological impact on Odette." His voice carried the weight of personal experience, understanding how Magnus wielded festive symbols as instruments of torture. As they wheeled him towards surgery, Thomas made one final request. He asked Detective Martinez to ensure that Christmas decorations be removed from Odette's line of sight when they found her, knowing from experience how Magnus would have corrupted their meaning during her captivity. This last instruction, delivered as anesthesia began to take effect, demonstrated his deep understanding of the psychological trauma Magnus inflicted. The surgical team worked with heightened urgency, aware that their patient's survival was intrinsically linked to a child's rescue. Outside the operating room, Detective Martinez coordinated with search teams, using Thomas's insights to refine their search parameters. His decision to undergo surgery, rather than continuing a potentially fatal pursuit, represented a profound trust in the community that had only recently recognized the truth of his past. As Thomas slipped into unconsciousness, his last thoughts were of Odette, hoping that his choice to prioritize survival would not come at the cost of her safety. The Christmas lights visible through the hospital windows seemed to blur and fade, their meaning transformed yet again by the complex interplay of past trauma and present hope. The Madison Medical Center's conference room transformed into an impromptu gathering space as community leaders assembled to formally acknowledge their misjudgment of Thomas Bennett. Principal Matthews, representing Riverside Elementary School, initiated the proceedings with a public statement that reflected the community's shifting perspective. Our rush to judgment regarding Mr. Bennett's character and intentions represents a failure of our community's values, Principal Matthews declared, her voice carrying genuine remorse. We allowed preconceptions and misunderstandings to cloud our evaluation of a man who, we now understand, was fighting battles we couldn't see. The Riverside Heights Neighborhood Association, led by Eleanor Richmond, presented a comprehensive plan to support Thomas's recovery and Odette's eventual return. Their initiative included establishing a neighborhood watch program, organizing meal deliveries during Thomas's rehabilitation, and creating a support network for Odette's reintegration into the school community. Business leaders who had previously distanced themselves from Thomas now committed substantial resources to aid the ongoing search efforts. The Chamber of Commerce announced the creation of a dedicated fund to support law enforcement's investigation, while local companies offered their facilities as coordination centers for search operations. Former employees who had lost their jobs over the Christmas decoration incident received formal apologies and reinstatement offers with additional compensation. The company's board of directors acknowledged that Thomas's reaction, while severe, stemmed from trauma they had failed to recognize or understand. Local media outlets published retractions of their previous negative coverage, accompanied by in-depth investigations into the systemic failures that had allowed Magnus to operate undetected for so long. These reports highlighted the danger of quick judgments and the importance of understanding trauma's long-term effects on behavior. The medical staff witnessed a steady stream of visitors bringing letters of support and apology to Thomas's recovery room. Each message acknowledged not only their misunderstanding of his actions but also their failure to recognize the signs of long-term trauma in his behavior. The hospital's administrative board established new protocols for identifying and supporting patients with complex trauma histories, using insights gained from Thomas's case. Community religious leaders organized interfaith prayer services, replacing their previous criticism with messages of hope and healing. Their congregations, which had once whispered judgments about Thomas's character, now joined in collective support for his recovery and Odette's safe return. This transformation in community attitude manifested most powerfully in the renovation of Thomas's company lobby. Employees and neighbors collaborated to create a healing space that honored both Christmas traditions and trauma sensitivity, demonstrating their newfound understanding of how environmental triggers affect survivors of abuse. Through these actions, the community began the process of rebuilding trust, acknowledging that their quick judgments had compounded the trauma of a man who had spent decades fighting battles they were only beginning to understand. Mrs. Henderson's path to redemption began when she discovered Magnus's true connection to Thomas through the police investigation files. The revelation of how he had manipulated her maternal instincts to gain access to Odette devastated her, but rather than succumb to guilt, she chose decisive action. Upon learning of Magnus's latest location from their previous communications, Mrs. Henderson made the calculated decision to approach him alone. She contacted Detective Martinez first, providing detailed information about Magnus's patterns and preferences, then arranged a meeting under the pretense of delivering additional intelligence about Thomas's condition. The meeting took place in an abandoned church basement, a location Magnus had chosen for its cruel symbolism during the Christmas season. Mrs. Henderson maintained her facade of cooperation while wearing a concealed recording device, engaging Magnus in a conversation that revealed his elaborate plans for both Thomas and Odette. As Magnus detailed his intentions, Mrs. Henderson strategically positioned herself between him and the exit, knowing that police teams were surrounding the building. Her actions bought crucial time for law enforcement to complete their preparations, though she understood the personal risk she was taking. When Magnus realized the deception, his reaction was swift and violent. Mrs. Henderson used her body to prevent his escape through a hidden exit she had previously observed during their communications. The physical confrontation that ensued allowed police teams to breach the building, though Mrs. Henderson sustained serious injuries in the process. Her sacrifice provided law enforcement with the opportunity they needed to apprehend Magnus without endangering other civilians. More importantly, her recorded conversation contained critical information about Odette's location and the extent of Magnus's network of safe houses. From her hospital bed, Mrs. Henderson provided authorities with detailed documentation of every interaction she had conducted with Magnus, including communications she had previously withheld out of misplaced loyalty. Her testimony proved instrumental in building a comprehensive case against him. The housekeeper's actions, while not erasing her earlier betrayal, demonstrated genuine remorse and a willingness to risk personal safety to correct her mistakes. Her detailed knowledge of Magnus's methodology, gained through weeks of unwitting complicity, proved invaluable to the investigation. Thomas, upon learning of Mrs. Henderson's role in both his betrayal and eventual rescue, responded with unexpected grace. He arranged for the finest medical care during her recovery, and understanding how Magnus had exploited her maternal instincts, offered her a path to redemption through continued employment focused on establishing improved security protocols for vulnerable children. Through her sacrifice, Mrs. Henderson not only aided in Magnus's capture but also provided a powerful example of how acknowledgement of mistakes, coupled with decisive action to correct them, could contribute to healing and reconciliation. Following her rescue, Odette faced the complex task of reconciling with those who had inadvertently enabled Magnus's actions. Her first significant step toward forgiveness occurred during a carefully structured meeting with Mrs. Henderson in the hospital's family counseling center, where both were recovering from their respective ordeals. Odette demonstrated remarkable emotional maturity as she listened to Mrs. Henderson's explanation of how Magnus had manipulated her beliefs about family bonds and parental rights. The young girl recognized in the housekeeper's misguided actions the same vulnerability to manipulation that she herself had experienced under Magnus's influence. "I understand why you thought you were helping Odette," told Mrs. Henderson, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "Magnus made everyone see what he wanted them to see." This insight, profound for an 8-year-old, reflected her developing understanding of how manipulation could affect even well-intentioned adults. Her forgiveness extended to the school administrators who had questioned Thomas's guardianship. During a private meeting with Principal Matthews, Odette articulated how their skepticism had inadvertently reinforced Magnus's narrative. Rather than expressing anger, she helped establish new protocols for evaluating concerns about student welfare, ensuring that future assessments would consider more comprehensive evidence. The neighbors who had shunned her received similar grace. Odette participated in community meetings where she shared age-appropriate versions of her experiences, helping others understand how their quick judgments had contributed to her isolation. Her willingness to engage in these discussions facilitated healing not just for herself but for the entire community. Perhaps most significantly, Odette worked with child psychologists to develop a program helping other young trauma survivors navigate forgiveness and reconciliation. Her experiences became a foundation for understanding how children could process betrayal without becoming emotionally hardened by it. Through these acts of forgiveness, Odette demonstrated the resilience that had drawn Thomas to protect her initially. She transformed potentially traumatic experiences into opportunities for growth and understanding, showing wisdom beyond her years in recognizing that healing required extending grace to those who had failed her. This capacity for forgiveness ultimately strengthened her bond with Thomas, as they both learned to trust again despite their experiences of betrayal. Their shared journey of healing became a powerful testimony to the possibility of overcoming trauma through understanding and compassion. Thomas's recovery exceeded medical expectations, his determination to protect Odette, providing motivation through grueling rehabilitation sessions. The cardiac surgery's success, combined with his unwavering focus on healing, enabled him to regain strength more rapidly than his doctors had anticipated. Throughout his recovery, he maintained daily contact with the legal team prosecuting Magnus's case. The trial proceedings against Magnus revealed the full extent of his decades-long campaign of manipulation and abuse. The prosecution presented extensive evidence, including testimony from multiple victims, forensic financial records tracing his various identities, and detailed documentation of his systematic exploitation of social service systems. Thomas's testimony, delivered with composed dignity, provided crucial context about the generational impact of Magnus's actions. The court acknowledged the broader implications of the case by implementing new protocols for tracking suspected identity fraud in adoption and foster care systems. Magnus's methodology became a case study for law enforcement agencies nationwide, leading to improved screening procedures and enhanced protection for vulnerable children. The verdict reflected the severity of Magnus's crimes. The judge, citing the calculated nature of his actions and the extensive psychological damage inflicted on multiple victims, imposed the maximum sentence allowable by law. Magnus would spend the remainder of his life in a maximum security facility with no possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, Thomas addressed the court with remarkable composure. His statement focused not on retribution but on the importance of protecting future generations from similar manipulation. His words carried particular weight as he detailed plans to establish a foundation dedicated to identifying and preventing systematic abuse within child welfare systems. But the resolution of the case brought closure not only to Thomas and Odette, but to numerous other victims who had lived in fear of Magnus's influence. The legal proceedings exposed systemic vulnerabilities that had enabled his actions, leading to comprehensive reforms in child protection services. As Thomas left the courthouse following the verdict, he walked with renewed purpose. The successful prosecution of Magnus marked the end of a dark chapter, allowing him to focus entirely on building a secure future for Odette and supporting other survivors through their healing journeys. The Bennett Enterprises atrium underwent a meaningful transformation for its first official Christmas celebration. Under Thomas's guidance, the space was thoughtfully decorated to honor both the holiday spirit and trauma sensitivity. Soft white lights replaced harsh displays, while nature-inspired decorations created a peaceful atmosphere that welcomed everyone regardless of their past experiences with the season. The celebration brought together an unprecedented gathering of the community. Former employees, now reinstated with Thomas's support, worked alongside current staff to coordinate an event that emphasized healing and connection. The previously austere corporate environment evolved into a space where children from local shelters could experience the holiday's joy in a safe, supportive setting. Thomas's participation in the festivities marked a significant personal evolution. Though he maintained a composed demeanor, his interaction with guests demonstrated genuine engagement rather than obligatory presence. His brief address to the assembled company focused on transformation and second chances, acknowledging how community support had facilitated healing for both himself and Odette. The event featured thoughtfully planned activities that accommodated various comfort levels with holiday celebrations. Quiet spaces were designated for those who, like Thomas, needed occasional respite from the festivities. Professional counselors remained discreetly available, ensuring that the celebration supported rather than challenged individual healing journeys. Odette's contribution to the celebration proved particularly meaningful. She worked with art therapists to create an installation that depicted the journey from trauma to healing, incorporating traditional holiday elements in ways that reclaimed their positive significance. Her artwork provided a powerful testimony to resilience while offering hope to other survivors. The evening concluded with a ceremony that balanced festive tradition with respectful acknowledgement of different experiences. Rather than focusing solely on holiday customs, the gathering celebrated the community's collective growth and understanding. The event established a new paradigm for corporate holiday celebrations, demonstrating how institutional empathy could create meaningful change. In the year following Magnus's conviction, Thomas and Odette established new holiday traditions that honored their shared journey of healing. Their approach to celebrating Christmas evolved into a thoughtful blend of remembrance and renewal, creating customs that acknowledge their past while embracing hope for the future. The transformation of their home environment reflected this balanced perspective. Together, they designed a winter garden on their penthouse terrace, incorporating evergreen plants and subtle lighting that provided festive ambience without triggering difficult memories. This living installation became their alternative to traditional Christmas decorations, symbolizing growth and resilience through all seasons. Educational initiatives became central to their shared mission. Thomas established the Bennett Foundation for Child Protection, with Odette contributing age-appropriate insights to its programs. Their partnership in this endeavor demonstrated how trauma survival could be channeled into meaningful advocacy, particularly during the holiday season, when vulnerable children faced increased risks. Their private celebrations developed distinct characteristics that reflected their unique family bond. Rather than exchanging traditional gifts, they instituted a tradition of sharing creative projects that represented their personal growth throughout the year. Odette's artistic expressions and Thomas's architectural designs became tangible markers of their healing journey. Professional support remained integrated into their holiday routine, with both participating in regular therapy sessions that helped them navigate seasonal challenges. This commitment to maintaining mental health support demonstrated their understanding that healing was an ongoing process requiring consistent attention and care. The penthouse's transformation extended beyond aesthetic changes. They redesigned living spaces to incorporate areas for artistic expression, quiet reflection, and collaborative projects. This environmental evolution supported their emotional well-being while providing opportunities for strengthening their family bond through shared activities. Their influence extended into the corporate sphere, where Thomas implemented policies that recognized and accommodated employees' diverse experiences with holiday celebrations. This institutional change reflected his growing understanding that healing often required community-wide transformation. The annual Bennett Foundation Holiday Symposium became a platform for sharing their experiences with other survivors and advocates. This event, carefully structured to be inclusive and trauma-informed, provided resources and support while celebrating the resilience of survivors and their families. As their new traditions took root, Thomas and Odette demonstrated that recovery from trauma could include reclaiming and reimagining celebrations that had once been sources of pain. Their example inspired other families in similar situations to develop their own healing-centered holiday practices. Through these thoughtfully constructed traditions, Thomas and Odette created a legacy of resilience and hope. Their story became a testament to the possibility of transformation, showing how careful attention to healing could create meaningful celebrations that honored both past experiences and future possibilities. What do you think about Thomas and Odette's journey? We'd love to hear your thoughts on how trauma can shape our responses to holidays and celebrations. How would you have handled the situation differently? Share your perspective in the comments below. Your insights could help others facing similar challenges. If you found value in this story of healing and redemption, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We share powerful stories of human resilience and transformation every day, each carefully crafted to inspire and encourage meaningful discussions. If this story touched your heart, please share it with friends and family who might benefit from its message. Every share helps spread understanding about trauma, healing, and the power of second chances. Together, we can build a more compassionate and understanding community.